Moral judgment. In divided times, this is a weighty issue. Do we judge others or refrain? Do we judge in one sense, but not in another? I'm Cody Libolt, and I'll introduce our topic today, and then I'm going to interview Jacob Brunton. Let's start with looking at Deuteronomy 1:6. God commands his people, hear the case between your brothers, and judge righteously between a man and his brother. Jesus tells people in John 7:24, judge with righteous judgment. 1 Corinthians 2:15 tells us the spiritual person judges all things, but is himself judged by no one. But there are also strong cautions. So James 4:12 says, there's only one lawgiver and judge. He is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So already we've got some question marks. Are they talking about the same thing here? James 1:26, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, that person's religion is worthless. You have to bridle your tongue. That's a big caution in Scripture. So be careful of judging others. We're warned by Paul in Romans 14:1, don't quarrel over disputable matters. So there's a lot of cautions in the Bible. Hey, don't be starting fights that you don't need to start. Matthew 6:14-15, we have to forgive others. Otherwise, we're not going to be forgiven. So if the situation were not already potentially confusing, then there's the most misused verse in all of Scripture. In Matthew 7, it says, judge not. So how is that compatible with the other place where Jesus said judge? I think it's helpful if we'll read through the rest of that passage. But what is the principle involved here? What does godly wisdom look like today as we appeal to others to contend for the faith that was once and for all delivered to the saints? We should sometimes correct others, and yet at the same time, in some sense, we are warned against judging. So what do we make of this? Now, as a Christian, you've probably already studied this issue and decided to some degree that it's right to make mental distinctions between good and evil in all areas of life. But what is the thing the Bible is cautioning us not to do? And here's where this issue particularly affects Christians. If you're intellectually minded and if you're writing to discuss current events, this whole don't judge refrain has become a bludgeon in the hand of a lot of liberalizers. So let me explain what I mean by that. There's this tactic that has been used for over 100 years. Typically, someone that is trying to move Christianity in a liberal direction doesn't openly come out saying, I favor this position that betrays biblical orthodoxy. Instead, they come out in favor of being more tolerant. Being more tolerant means we shouldn't judge this or that as being evil, in their words. And they say, if you do that, you're evil. And so that's a sad kind of hypocrisy. And many of the most vicious people are the ones that are trying to tell others to stop judging. So what's the alternative? Are you supposed to be someone who angrily condemns others and sounds hateful? Absolutely not. Titus 3:2 rules out harsh, unforgiving judgment. It says, be gentle. Show perfect courtesy toward all people. God opposes the proud, says James 4:6. So what then? Be someone who doesn't speak out about important issues? Do you just, when somebody else is looking to speak out about important issues, do you just kind of look crosswise at them? Say like, I just don't think you should do that. That's what we see a lot in the church today. But no, that's not the right response. The healthy alternative to misplaced judgment or to hypocritical judgment is what Jesus called right judgment. And that's what we're going to explore today. What does right judgment look like? How can you exercise it, especially if you're publicly advocating for a certain viewpoint? I think a good starting place is Jesus says in Luke 6:31, as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. Consistency is a key principle here. Consistency as relates to the moral necessity of judgment. So if you want to say to people, don't judge, guess what? That's a judgment. So you've already been inconsistent. But if you want to say do judge, that is a judgment. And that's just fine. That's consistent. So that's it. That's my thoughts as an opener. Jacob, I want to know, what are your interactions with what I've said so far, and where would you like to take this discussion?
Yeah, I think everything you said is spot on. Something I've always noticed and tried to point out, especially about the judge not lest you be judged passage, is that very shortly after Jesus says that, he goes on to give instructions on how to make judgments about people. You can know a tree by its fruits, and things like that. And so he obviously is not saying that there is no role for judgment. He's giving a warning about the way you go about judging. And so I think there are some distinctions, some helpful distinctions that can be made that you alluded to in a sense of the Bible wants us to be careful how we judge, what we're making judgments about. Is it appropriate to be making a judgment about, the thing that we're making a judgment about? Are we drawing appropriate conclusions in our judgment? Because you can make a judgment about something, and the judgment might be accurate, but you might end up drawing inappropriate conclusions about that judgment. For instance, you might judge a tree by its fruits and say, as far as I can tell, this person is not a Christian, or as far as I can tell, this person is a false teacher, which is the point of what Jesus is warning about in that passage. But then you would overstep your bounds, I would argue, if you were to say, I'm making a judgment now that this person is going to hell for sure, right? And so that would be an inappropriate conclusion to draw from the accurate judgment that you made. And so there are all kinds of cautions about how we go about judging and the conclusions we draw from those judgments that are appropriate and that Scripture lays upon us, but we shouldn't take those to mean that we shouldn't judge at all. And in fact, there are, and I think you mentioned a few, and we'll probably get into more, that there are a number of places in Scripture that explicitly command us to judge or admonish us to make judgments. I think of 1 Corinthians 2:15. The spiritual man appraises all things. What does it mean to appraise something? It means to judge the value of it. So, Paul says the spiritual man, if you want to be spiritual, you need to judge everything. And so the issue is not judgment per se. It's how do you go about doing it? Are you doing it accurately? And that's the important thing that we need to ferret out.
All right, so that gives us a foundation for this subject. Thanks for that, Jacob. Now, the next question I want to ask you is, why is this issue of such importance? Assuming that you and I are on the right track here, and that there's something to this, and that we can explain the issue. First of all, why does it even matter? Like, what's at stake here?
What's at stake? Everything. To fail to make judgments, let's just start in your own mind, right? Just in your own mind, not even pronouncing the judgment or sharing your judgment with others, but just in your own mind or in your own heart. The failure to make judgments it is the failure to recognize the goodness or the evil of what is true in reality, right? So there is objective goodness and there is objective evil in reality. There's objective truth and objective falsehood. There are objectively right things and objectively wrong things. There are good arguments and bad arguments. There's good actions and bad actions. And the Bible makes that distinction over and over again. In fact, I think it's Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good." And so without making judgments, you're not going to be able to distinguish between good and evil, and you're going to end up calling that woe down upon yourself. You're going to end up wandering into things that are evil and twisted and wicked, and not being able to fix your mind on things that are good and true and beautiful and holy, right? So just for your own, the health of your own soul and the health of your own relationship with God, the failure to make judgments is the failure to be in a healthy relationship with God. It's impossible to live a healthy life as a human being and as a Christian without making judgments. And then when you extend that out beyond just in your own mind and your own soul to the way that you interact with others, and especially the way that you communicate judgments with others, the same thing applies just on a social scale. It matters what you admonish others to do or others to avoid. If you admonish others to avoid what is actually good because you're mistaken in your judgment, or because you refuse to make a judgment explicitly, or vice versa, if you um, uh, admonish people to do what is evil, then you are leading people in bad and unhealthy and God glory robbing directions. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, what I've observed within the church, especially the church that I grew up in and some other churches that I've seen that are similar to that, especially the seeker-sensitive model of churches, is that is what you're describing is not on the minds of the pastors as they're explaining the Bible. And, it brings me back to, in the story of Jonah, when there's the city of Assyria or Nineveh, but the Assyrians
Yeah.
people,
Uh-huh.
and they, how they don't know their right hand from their left, or there's like 200,000 or something that don't know their right hand from their left. I don't know if that's referring to the children of the city, but God describes people that don't know right from wrong in that way. And I realize just the importance of, like, if you're a parent and you want to raise your children to maturity, one of the greatest gifts that you give them is you say, hey, there's a difference between right and wrong. And everything that you teach them is teaching them this is true, this is false, this is right, this is wrong. And just growing up with that paradigm that's how you should think about things, that is very different from the way some people grow up. And I'm looking at the way churches are teaching on this issue. And maybe there's some implicit, hey, this is the right way to follow, this is the wrong way to follow. But I think churches tend to lack the emphasis that says the law of the Lord is good.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of different factors that fall into that atmosphere or that culture. One of them is the aversion towards individualism, because ultimately, to make a judgment is to participate in independent thought, right? The alternative to thinking and judging independently is to sort of blindly follow the crowd, and in the church, that's often how it plays out. Like you said, there's an implicit idea of right and wrong sometimes in most churches, but it's sort of fuzzy. And I think the reason it's fuzzy is because the extent to which people in those atmospheres think about right and wrong is the extent to which they think what they mean, what it would translate to if you could get into their subconscious and see what do they mean by right and wrong. What they mean is what most Christians around me approve of is right, and what most Christians around me disapprove of is wrong. And that's sort of how they function. They're not usually capable of making an independent judgment about what's right and wrong in a way that is separate or distinct or independent from the rest of the church or from other Christians. And so the anti-individualism or emphasis on collectivism in the church culture really plays a lot into that, I think.
That's called the social metaphysics.
Yeah.
Which is a transition to something I wanted to share with you from Rand. I have a quote from Ayn Rand about judgment, which we as Christians have to think carefully through and be ready to judge her words. But here's what it says: one must never fail to pronounce moral judgment. And then she goes on, nothing can corrupt and disintegrate a culture or a man's character as thoroughly as does the precept of moral agnosticism. The idea that one must never pass moral judgment on others. Now, have you ever heard this or sensed it from other people? You must never pass moral judgment on others. There's such a hypocrisy in saying you must do something if that's the thing that you're saying. So, she says that one must be morally tolerant of anything, that the good consists of never distinguishing good from evil. She's got such a good way with words. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something that I actually realized was a huge not theme, but trend within the church, well before I ever discovered Rand. In fact, my old pastor, Matt Marino, whom some of you probably follow on Facebook, he used to put it by saying, the great heresy today is naming heresies, or the major evil in the church today is calling something evil, and that was a very apt description. And it's funny because Rand ends up saying something very similar she doesn't use the theological language of the church and heresy, but she makes a similar critique of the culture at large. And it's very much the case within the church, if not more so the case within the church, that you can make judgments all day long about people who are judgmental, quote unquote. You can call people who are intellectually minded evil all the live long day and get away with it. But that's the only thing that you're allowed to make judgments about. And like you said, it's an ironic hypocrisy, but it's also really twisted and evil. Like don't lose sight of the fact that hypocrisy is a sign of twisted evil. It's a way of trying to hide one's evil. And the thing that's really evil about that ideology is that the only thing that can benefit from it is evil, right? That's the ultimate shield for evil against the good, is to say that the only evil is to make judgments about something being evil.
It's running interference for the evil.
Exactly. Yes. That's the ultimate defense. And so if that's the case, in that atmosphere, that's where evil can most thrive. And I think we're seeing that that's the case in the church today. It allows evil to thrive and encourages evil by giving it somewhat of the moral high ground.
The rest of Rand's quote is exactly what you're saying. She says, "It is obvious who profits and loses by such a precept.
Yep.
It's not justice or equal treatment that you grant to men when you abstain equally from praising men's virtues and from condemning men's vices. When your impartial attitude declares in effect that neither the good nor the evil may expect anything from you, whom do you betray and whom do you encourage?" And then she goes on to talk about the responsibility of moral judgment. So I think this would be a good time to open up the floor, and because we've laid out some ideas here, I'd like to hear your interactions. First of all, I want to ask, what questions come to mind so far? Just briefly stated questions come to mind.
Anyone?
And these may be questions that you already know the answer to, but I'm just curious what they are.
I have a question.
Okay.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hi.
How do you reconcile Rand's definition of morality with Christianity's definition, if we can?
When you say definition, do you have particular definitions in mind, or you just mean her view of morality with the general Christian view?
Yeah, I'd say the general Christian view, yeah.
Okay, that's a really wide-ranging question. Could you specify what you think appears irreconcilable? That would help us to answer it.
Okay, so yeah, that is a very wide question. I guess it touched on a question of whether there is an objective morality. And as Christians, of course, we're going to say yes. We claim that by faith, right? But generally speaking, my understanding is Rand doesn't agree with Christianity's view of what is a wide-ranging objective morality, whatever that might be as a Christian principle. For example, Rand might not say that homosexuality is ungodly. I don't know if she'd even say fornication is ungodly. And we can go on and on. She may not condemn adultery, for example.
Well, actually, so she wouldn't say it's ungodly because she's an atheist.
Right.
But she would say
immoral.
Yeah, she would say those things are immoral.
She would say homosexuality is immoral?
Yeah. There's debate about that among contemporary objectivist philosophers because she didn't really write much on the subject. But what she did write on the subject, the little that she did, was that it repulsed her, and she thought it was the result of a psychological weakness or deficiency or disorder. So she personally, at least, saw homosexuality as immoral and corrupt. There are some contemporary objectivist philosophers who argue that she didn't have a very good philosophical reason for that was just her being influenced by the culture. So it's hard to say on that. With adultery and fornication, she absolutely I mean, she wouldn't define fornication the same way that the Bible does for various reasons, but she absolutely had a very high and what we would call holy view of sex. She did not think that cheap sex or casual sex was moral. She thought it was disgustingly immoral because she thought that sex is so important to human life. One ought to hold it in high esteem and only partake in it in the context of a very serious, committed relationship where you're with somebody who represents the highest of your values. And so she actually held sex to be higher and I would say holier than many Christians do today. Now, the applications of that are going to work themselves out in different ways, but the general view, especially her philosophical view, is really high. I would recommend reading, I think, the introduction to the Romantic Manifesto. She talks about, I mean, it's about art, but she talks about the role of philosophy in our affections, and she uses romantic love and sexual desire as a illustration of that. And as you read that, you get a sense for her view of sex and the role of sex in human life, and you see, wow, she's got a very different view of it than the most atheists do.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah. Adam had his hand up next, so we'll go to Adam and then Greg. We can't hear you, Adam. Still can't hear you. Are you muted? Oh, we can hear you
not
now.
Anymore. You got me?
Hear you now. Yep.
Okay. About the range of issues on which someone must make moral judgment. So, like, how small does it get? You know, whether you take out a bank loan from an immoral in an immoral society, where an interest rate might be fractionally, you know, affected, that could, you know, minimally affect the government's, I don't know.
Be a little bit more explicit. I think I know what you mean, but flesh that out a little bit more.
Buying caviar from a Soviet, you know, country, you know, where it's gonna affect them, or buying tickets to ballet, you know, from a country that you don't agree with. And like, how much are we giving sanction in the smaller, like if we're explicitly not sanctioning the evil, but there's some way that somebody could construe it as our support as sanctioning. I'm just wondering, is like what's the level at which one needs to really worry about how great one is sanctioning one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me first off say that it's helpful when you're thinking about this to make a distinction between making a moral judgment and what we ought to do in light of that moral judgment. So, for instance, you can make a moral judgment about, let's say, the Soviet Union, that it is evil. And that's a separate question from how I ought to interact with the Soviet Union if I'm interacting with it at all, right? But I think what you're getting to is once I have deemed that a person or a organization or something like that, or a country is morally evil, how ought I to think about my interactions with them?
Right. And to what level should what my interactions be carefully divided so that it's not seen as sanctioning the evil?
I mean, there's going to be a lot of contextual issues that go into it, and so in a lot of ways, that's going to be a little bit more of a concrete scientific issue than you can answer in one fell swoop, because I don't know that you can really assign a particular level, so to speak. But you have to take into context the extent to which that entity is immoral, or evil. The extent to which the thing that you're doing is valuable or necessary for your values.
Right.
The extent to which others might take it to be a sanction versus not. And I think there's a good example of this with Paul talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols.
Right.
It's immoral to sacrifice meat to idols. And that's the first step of the moral judgment that he has in his mind in this process. But he says it's not immoral to eat meat sacrificed to idols so long as you understand that you're not worshiping the idol.
Right. And nobody's getting that impression from you.
Exactly. And so it could be immoral to eat meat sacrificed to idols if you're doing so in a public fashion around people.
I think he says it actually is, a sin if you know that that's the case. So like something that isn't a sin actually becomes a sin.
Yeah. In which case it's not the eating itself that's a sin.
Right.
It's the causing your brother to stumble, which is a sin.
Right. The publicity of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so I'm thinking about the David Kelly talking to libertarian dinner club debate that happened in objectivism back in the 80s, where Peter Schwartz and Peikoff kind of came up pretty hard against him and said that he was sanctioning libertarianism because he was making the objectivist case in front of a libertarian audience. And so I've been kind of steeped in that debate, the documents that came out of that debate the last couple of weeks. And so I got that in my mind, which doesn't really apply in our culture. Like we're not living in a society that overjudges. But in an objectivist world, that could be a downfall. I mean, I'm not seeing that happen anytime soon.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm actually not super familiar with that. Cody might be more familiar with the context of that whole debate. So I'll let him chime in on this in a second. Sure. But I will say what I do know is that currently the major disagreement with David Kelly is that he disagrees on some fundamental ideas about objectivism, not necessarily that he was sanctioning libertarianism, although that might have been a major objection towards him in the past. Right. In addition to that, there are a lot of people that object to Euron Brook interacting with the likes of Jordan Peterson, right, and others for along the similar lines. And he's argued that you're not sanctioning them if you make it clear that you disagree with them.
And they did.
Yeah. And so I think if that's the case, and I'll just go back to the biblical example of eating meat sacrificed to idols. I think if you made it very clear, if for some reason you thought it was important to eat the meat, maybe your children were going to starve and that was the only food around, right? And so it was important that you eat the meat. I think it would be okay in the context of people thinking that it was a sin, so long as you made it very clear, hey, I believe that eating meat sacrificed to idols is not a sin. Here's why, and you gave your arguments to those people. And if they chose to still be offended by it, then that's on them.
Right, and you probably wouldn't do it as publicly, and
yeah. I mean, try to make it less public if possible. But yeah. Cody, do you have anything to add on the historical context of that?
No, I don't know the situation in depth. I know that it was a leadership crisis where it's like feels like somebody was doing something that goes against what the group was doing, and there's a value in paying attention to what your group's aims are and what the leaders of that group's aims are, and communicating these things ahead of time. And I just think it was a breakdown, but I don't know.
Cool. I think that sufficiently covers at least the general way to address that type of thing.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks. Greg, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to say, I definitely agree, because I've had situations recently where I've had Christians tell me, don't judge. Oh, judge not. And it's it's become a cliche that's not what the Bible actually says, because as you pointed out, there's places all through Scripture, including in that same passage, that talk about judging rightly, judging a tree by its fruit, talks about in the New Testament, it actually commands Christians to judge those within the church in certain instances. And I think that was the instance with the man who was having an affair with his father's wife. But I could be mistaken. But my question here is, so since there are plenty of places in the Bible that do talk about judging and judging rightly and having that right moral judgment, what is Jesus talking about here in Matthew, at the beginning of Matthew chapter 7, where we do get this famous command to judge not? Like, what is he getting at? I have it open here if we need to read it too.
Well, I think it's helpful to realize that what he says is, judge not lest you be judged. And then he goes on to say, for in the manner in which you judge, or the extent to which you judge, in the same way you will be judged. So his point is that the standard you use to judge others by is the standard by which you will be judged. And so if you judge others unfairly or unjustly, God will likewise judge you in that way and find you wanting. So it's a warning about consistency, and a warning about how you go about your judgments. And the way we know that it's not a blanket command not to judge at all is because, like you said, he goes on to give instructions on how to judge. And Jesus doesn't, contradict himself in the same breath, obviously. And so it's pretty obvious that he's giving a warning about unjust judgments. So some ways to judge unjustly would be to jump to a conclusion before you have all the evidence or all the testimony that would be relevant to make the judgment. Another way would be to have an overly punitive response to a negative thing in someone else. Say, Adam slights me by accident somehow, and I respond in my own mind by saying Adam's a complete worthless, evil human being that I never want to be friends with again. That's obviously unjust. The punishment, so to speak, even though I'm not hurting him, the judgment in my mind doesn't match the crime at all. And the idea is, if you go around doing that to other people, God's going to do that to you. Not that God really could give you more of a punishment than you deserve, since you deserve infinite punishment. But the analogy is that you deserve that, right? Think of any way that you could go about judging others in an unhealthy or unjust or inconsistent way. And I think that's what Jesus is warning against there.
So it's kind of like Romans 2, where we have Romans 1, which we love talking about on here. And then Romans 2, I think, talks about if somebody, those of you if you're preaching against adultery, are you committing adultery? And like here, Matthew, in the beginning of Matthew 7, it talks about, the log and the speck. It's like, why are you trying to take the speck out of your brother's eye, not the log out of your own eye? Mm-hmm. And I think people almost stop there. And because the very next thing, and I didn't quite realize this till just before we started talking about this, it says, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So if this is talking about in terms of, like, I was thinking of this very pictorially, but this is in the context of judging. So if I have it where I'm saying, hey, I'm doing this, I see my brother doing something wrong, it's first, hey, stop for a minute. Yes, okay, that's wrong. Examine myself. Make sure that I'm, not, doing the same thing wrong, or, make sure that I'm doing what's right before God. Because I guess from even Rand might appreciate this, the only person that I can make right, the main person that I'm supposed to make right before God is myself. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how well I'm wording that, but But then after you've done that assessment and maybe you've made that change that's necessary, then you can say to your brother, hey, I see that you're doing these things in your life. It's not healthy. It's not good. Let me help you to get better with this.
Yeah, and it's important to see that Jesus says, so that you may take the speck out of your brother's eye, right? So the reason you're supposed to judge yourself first is so that you're better equipped to judge others. And I think it's helpful to realize, and this is implied in what you were just saying, that too often we think of judgment as a purely or almost exclusively negative thing. Like judgment is tearing others down or lifting yourself above others. And I think that's a really unhealthy view of what judgment is. It's better to think of judgment as, I want what's good and true and beautiful for myself and for as many other people as possible. And the way to get it is to make judgments about what is good and true and beautiful, and to make judgments about things that are against what's good and true and beautiful, and to help others overcome those things that are against what's good and true and beautiful. And so the point of judgment is a positive orientation towards what is good. It's not about comparing yourself. And so, and that's a really collectivistic way of coming about it, where it's all about your relationship to other people. But that's not the way that I think the Bible wants us to think about judgment. Our relationship to other people doesn't matter as much as our relationship to what is good and true and beautiful does, and as much as their relationship to what is good and true and beautiful does. Does that make sense? So if you come at the topic of judgment in an individualistic fashion, we are thinking about me as an individual and them as an individual, and my relationship and their relationship to the good, to the true, rather than our relationship to each other. You get rid of that negative connotation that comes along with judgment that most people jump to in our culture. Go ahead, Greg, and then Adam had something.
So, it's kind of strange because it's like usually we're so focused on individualism here. So that almost makes me think of like, hey, okay, group, we're in a church, or maybe group of people, men in the military, and maybe one person saying to another, hey, we're both trying to connect to what's good. And so it's me helping those around me because these are people that I'm a part of. And trying to say, hey, let's do things in a better way.
Yeah. Please don't fall in that hole. Right?
Don't step on that landmine.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying that you're going to hell. I'm just saying you're about to step on a landmine, and I don't want you to. Go ahead, Adam.
I was thinking about it in terms of just going back to the judging in the same measure that you judge others. You'll be measured yourself, and just thinking about others, especially within the body of Christ, and treating them as if they're not in Christ. Just like you need to be in Christ. Relating to somebody else as if they're not in Christ when they are, and how that would be a wrong-minded way of relating to the body, against this perfect, Christ's perfect righteousness, which is the judgment whereby we're all judged, and then, but neglecting the fact that somebody needs to be in Christ to be connected to his righteousness. I think like it's easy to do that when we get into a, combative situation with a spouse or with another believer or whatever, like it's easy to start relating like they're not under the blood, or, they're somehow out of Christ. And I think that's kind of what Paul had in mind in that situation, or maybe not.
Yeah, no. And well, it's also another stumbling block for Christians, I think, that, and what you said reminded me of this, is the idea of being forgiven by God to some Christians means that there's no longer any room for judgment. Because in an ultimate sense, there is no more room for judgment in God's eyes towards us. And so there's a sloppy way that you can think about that and apply that.
So we can go step on landmines now.
Exactly.
By His grace.
Yeah. And that's what Paul wants to combat when he says, what should we keep on sinning so that grace may abound? By no means, right? Yeah. So the reason that God has saved us and forgiven us was so that we would be free to glorify him. That the point is glory. And if you don't make judgments and keep yourself from what is evil and stay on the path of what is good, you're going to fail to glorify him. That now, a failure to glorify him or falling into sin does not mean that you're no longer forgiven. It just means that you're not doing the thing that he forgave you for. You're not lining up with the purpose that he had in forgiving you. And if you are genuinely forgiven, then you have a deep and enduring love for God and love for his glory, such that you will hate that and you'll want to make judgments in order to glorify him more in the future.
Question.
Yeah.
All right. So just to clarify, when we make a moral judgment or a moral statement, in other words, and we get charged with being like the Pharisees, would you say the best response is to clarify that we are not, when we're making the moral judgment, we're not necessarily saying that the person is not going to be saved, but rather to, not step on the landmine? Would you say that's kind of the best way to respond to charges of being a Pharisee when we make moral judgments?
So let me back up just a little bit and give you what I think is the best mindset about the Pharisees, and that can inform your response, because I don't want to give you a concrete response because it's probably going to vary by context, but I think there's a really good mindset for thinking about the Pharisees that'll help in those situations, and that is that, and this is something else I need to give credit to my old pastor Matt for kind of introducing me to this way of thinking. We need to realize that the Pharisees, the quote unquote legalists, share the same sin as those who are licentious, in that they are finding excuses for inaction. The Pharisee obsesses over non-consequential laws and moral prohibitions in order to hide from himself and others that he doesn't give a rip about what's actually morally important and fundamental. And this is what Jesus chastised the Pharisees over. It wasn't that they cared too much about the law or that they cared too much about moral judgment. It was that they cared too much about minor things while neglecting the weightier things, right? They strained out a gnat while swallowing a camel. They obsessed over things that didn't really matter that much in order to hide the fact that they were reveling in sin that really did matter, in order to hide the fact that they didn't care about God's glory. And so the sin of the Pharisees is the same as the sin of the prostitute, in that they don't care about God's glory. In a way, the prostitute or the open, explicit sinner is just being more honest about it, whereas the Pharisee is trying to hide it by putting on a facade of caring about God's glory by focusing on small, inconsequential, moralistic things. Does that make sense? Go ahead. I think Cody and then Matt and then Greg.
So there was a church that I was at the other day where I heard the pastor preaching and say something along these lines. He said, sometimes we just get too much on the side of trying to follow the law, and sometimes we get too much on the side of grace. But the answer's in the middle. And I realized that whole paradigm of balance is the answer to everything makes it so that you end up saying, don't love righteousness too much and don't love grace too much.
In fact, that means the ideal is zero love for both, right? If they're opposites and it's on a spectrum, and this is 10 for righteousness and this is a 10 for grace, and the ideal is the middle, well, you got 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, until you get to 0 for both. And that's where the middle is. So that means that the ideal is 0 passion for either righteousness or grace. That's the ideal in that.
I think this example is one good way to demonstrate the broader epistemological point that balance is not necessarily, and it's an epistemological and an ethical point. Balance is not the criteria. It's not the standard in most situations, unless you're involving physical parameters like, the cake only bakes at this temperature. It needs to be between these parameters. But that's typically with moral concerns, that's not the way you handle it.
Yeah, and especially with moral principles.
You don't balance principles. You prioritize.
Yes, exactly. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was wondering, I think part of the reason that some people don't make moral judgments, sometimes it's cowardice, but sometimes it's also just uncertainty. It may be an issue they thought through well, but let's say like with public schools, I know we've had that conversation before. I don't think it's moral to send your kid to public school. I think that's immoral. But the church at large, I shouldn't say the church at large, but most of the people in the church would say that it is perfectly moral to send your kid to public school, even under ridiculous circumstances, living in the inner city and all kinds of problems. But I would say with issues that are a little bit more nuanced like that, which I don't know if that's really all that nuanced, but with issues that are a little more nuanced, I think some people, it's that they're uncertain about their position. Like they've researched it enough and they know that they know what's true, but because of so many people being against them on that issue, they're uncertain. So what would you say to somebody in that position as far as the necessity of speaking out on that issue? And
well, first I would say, for your own sake, take it seriously that a large number of people disagree, right? Let that be an indication to question and to rethink your response or your position, right? And do your best to find out why do they disagree. Don't take the mere fact that they disagree as a brute fact. Try to figure out what are their reasons, and then examine those and see if maybe you've made a mistake, right? And then if not, if you come to the conclusion that you're still right, in spite of the fact that they disagree with you, that comes back to the whole individualism thing. I think it's really important to hold to your own judgment, in spite of the fact that a large number of people, including a large number of people whom you respect and love and care about, disagree with you. Because if you really are right, then it's not going to be in your own interest, in their interest, or in the interest of the glory of God to violate that, right? And that's something else that Paul has to say is, let each man be right in his own conscience. Don't let the majority lord it over you, even if they're not doing so intentionally. Now, and then there's another step in terms of how should you go about voicing that judgment to them, or should you, and in what contexts? And I think that there are some contexts in which you should and some in which you shouldn't. I think if you're explicitly asked, you should definitely be honest. You should never give the impression that you agree with them. But I don't think that it's necessary to, without being prompted, explicitly condemn them. And there's a way to go about saying, hey, I think it's immoral and here are my reasons why. Or if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about my reasons why. I understand that you may not think it's immoral. So I make sure that they understand you're not claiming that they're not a Christian, or that you don't want to be friends with them. You're just saying this is my own conviction, and I would love to share it with you if you're interested. Does that help?
Yeah. I guess it kind of goes back to your point earlier about being sure you're presenting things in a way that shows that you're talking to them about it because you care about them, not because you're trying to make a judgment in a negative way.
Yeah, and make sure that they know that you hold that position for objective reasons that you've really considered, and that you know it's because you have certain values, and especially if there are certain things that they also value, that helps also to say, hey, you know, say, you know, like, we both value, you know, the psychological and intellectual health of our children, and I'm convinced that public education undermines that. And maybe they're not convinced of that. Obviously, they probably aren't. But just the realization that that's your motivation goes a long way in helping them not to feel like you're just trying to lord it over them, which is often the perception, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, on this issue of homeschooling, so we're planning on homeschooling our kids, and I'm watching a lot of homeschooling videos and getting in a lot of conversations when we just moved to a new town. And everybody's like, oh, are you going to send your kids to Winnie Mac, you know, the public school? We're like, no. And there's this expectation that you affirm the public school, and I can't do it. And but like, even in all the homeschool videos, I'm guessing 75% of them, when people are talking about homeschooling with reference to public school, there's this expectation that you affirm public school, even if you don't, you know, like, this is just what I've come to believe. This is what we're going to try with our kids. But if you can't do it, you know, and I know there are some situations where you can't do it. I don't think my mom could have homeschooled me. Like, single mom wasn't going to happen. You know, she had to work. But I mean, there's this expectation that you affirm that which you don't affirm.
Yeah.
And that I've really had to bite my tongue, because I mean, when you start talking about it, people want to hear that from you. They want to hear the permission to not make it a moral issue. Like, when you put it on the moral spectrum, even, they say, it's not a moral thing. You don't have any moral high ground. And I'm not trying to put myself on the moral high ground, but I do think it is a moral issue, and nobody else does. And I think if they did put it on the moral spectrum, then they'd have to evaluate, and it's too high price for a lot of people to even, you know, go there with their lifestyle.
Yeah, I think that illustrates really well why it's so important to remove the whole idea of interpersonal comparison when it comes to moral judgments, right? And this is endemic, and so this is something that we're going to have an uphill battle in fighting against. But the idea that by making a moral judgment, you are lifting yourself up above somebody else, whereas in reality, you're stating a fact, an objective fact about what you believe to be an objective reality, has nothing to do with your moral position above or below somebody else. But we take it to be that, and that's often the reason why people have such an aversion to it. Let me just real quickly on the homeschooling issue say, it might be helpful in the way that we approach that particular issue to realize there's a way to talk about it that can be even more clear, and that is maybe the issue of sending your kid to public school is less clear of a moral issue, especially when it comes to certain circumstances. Like Adam said, you know, your mom probably couldn't have done it. Whereas you can take a step back from that and say, it's more clear, at least I think, to say that public schooling itself is immoral, whether or not you send your kid, right? So you can say, I think the institution of public school is an immoral institution, but it happens to be the only option I have, and so I'm going to participate in it, even though I'm saying the whole time, this is immoral, I shouldn't have to participate in it. I'm being forced to participate in it against my own moral judgment, right? That I think is a clearer position to take that more people would probably be able to get on board with.
Yeah. But see, I would even have an issue with that, because I couldn't even get on board with that, because I think that the circumstances under which it's moral to send your kid to school, and I've thought about this a lot, to public school, not school, are very, very slim. Like, it's like I can't think of one in my head beyond, like you said, maybe the single mother issue where you literally don't have any other options. But even then, like you don't have a family member, you don't have their grandmother that would be willing to go through a program with them. Like nothing else is available. It just seems like a cop out for any instance. So well, I don't know. I don't want to make this whole discussion about just homeschooling.
Sure.
Continue on.
Sure. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. I know the strain in the gnat swallowed the camel passage. Jesus, condemns. So I know some people watching this might not be familiar with it. Jesus condemns the Pharisees, saying, "You strain at a gnat, yet you swallow a camel." According to the pastor at the church I grew up with, what he's referring to is like if a Pharisee was out and maybe he was jogging, if he accidentally swallowed a gnat, well, God's law said, to the Jews, don't eat blood. And so they would actually induce vomiting to try to get that gnat back up, which, was really Jesus saying, look, you're doing this all for show. And then he's accusing them of swallowing a camel. Now, they're probably not literally eating camel meat, and obviously a person can't literally swallow a camel, but that's basically what he was saying. It's like, hey, you're as Jacob pointed out, you're focusing so much on these tiny little things, and almost being obsessive about them, and you're totally ignoring, the things that are important, like helping the poor in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. But I think it's kind of when we talked about the homeschool stuff. There's I want to throw two things in the conversation that I think will be good, whether we keep going with them or not. I like to read Dr. Thomas Sowell a lot, and he talks about, he's an economist, happens to be African American. He talks about this high school, a public high school from back in the day that was all black, and this high school is almost like the Harvard of high schools, and pretty much everybody, I think he said basically anybody who was noteworthy in African American history went to this high school. So it was this amazing high school right near, it was in Washington, D.C., I think, and they were doing these amazing things. And I think it was actually started by Christians. So I am guessing based on the time period, because this was I think it was just after the Civil War that this high school was started, because that's when black students could legally be educated, and the Democrats couldn't, even though the Democrats were opposing it anyway. These students, they were doing amazing things, and they probably were learning the scriptures and things like that, and going home and hopefully learning scriptures from mom and dad too, because that's the way it's supposed to be. But these days, and I know it might vary from region to region. Maybe there's a place out there where high schools and public schools are doing things well. But like, I got a friend who's graduating from the same high school system that I graduated from. He's, much younger, more than 10 years younger than me. And he was telling me how they're, basically always being told, this new redefinition of sexuality and gender and everything. Before 2015, this idea that you could just pick your gender didn't exist. Maybe it did somewhere, but not. Like you guys, I'm sure all remember that this was not a thing before the whole Bruce Jenner incident. So it's like we have this total redefinition of reality, this total rewriting of reality that that your sexuality is innate, even though science has shown otherwise in all the medical literature. This idea that you can pick your gender, and that's, obviously foolishness. And of course, this idea that, males and females are identical except for their sex organs, which again is totally medically and psychologically completely wrong. And I had always been told a lot of these things, and I was shocked to learn that, and I'll digress on this in a second, but the average man is 2 to 3 times the average body strength, upper body strength of the average woman. And I was shocked when I first read that in college, because I'd always been told in school, oh no, boys and girls are really the same, men and women are the same. Oh no, women are stronger because we have babies. And so this total this worldview they're being indoctrinated with, and they're not even getting a good education anyway. It really does make me kind of look at the situation and say, hey, if I might have sent my kid to Dunbar High School. But a lot of what I'm seeing the kids in public schools today, it's like, it's definitely not the moral ideal, and they're being brainwashed into things that aren't good.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I won't say that you can never send your kid to high school, but like if you do send them to a public school, make sure that they're being vaccinated against the ideas they're going to be brainwashed into.
Yep. Absolutely. Cody, did you have something to add to that?
Oh, I was thinking about what we could do for the closing because we're getting about ready.
Oh, yes,
First
yes,
time.
we are. Yeah.
I have some closing thoughts, and maybe you could share some too.
Yeah, well, does anybody else have any burning questions on the whole idea of moral judgment before we close? Go ahead, Greg.
Sorry to jump right in. So in Christian circles, I had a statement recently where I said, a Christian by definition is somebody who's following Christ. And if you're not following Christ, maybe then, and there's no attempt, you're running the other direction. Okay, maybe you'll stumble once in a while you're trying to follow Christ, but if you're totally running the other direction, then, maybe you've been born again, maybe you've been saved, but at that, I can't really call that person a Christian if that's what their life is.
Uh-huh.
But I've been told, oh, how dare you question someone's salvation? That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make a distinction between the two. But can we legitimately say this person, there was, and I apologize if I'm going on just a little bit here. There was a talk show I've been told about. Two people were brought on, a man and a woman. The woman was on saying, oh, I don't believe in the virgin birth and substitutionary atonement like those fundamentalist Christians. The man, no friend of Christianity, turned to her and said, ma'am, if you don't believe in the virgin birth and substitutionary atonement, then you are, in no meaningful sense of the word, a Christian. So my question is it legitimate to be able to say, no, this person isn't actually a Christian, or even maybe to go a couple steps farther and say, no, this person clearly isn't saved?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to make sure that that they know what they're talking about, right? So someone might claim that they don't believe in the virgin birth or in the substitutionary atonement, but they might not actually know what they're talking about, right? So it could be the case that they do believe in it, but they're mistaken about what it is, and so they think that they don't believe in it, right? So be careful with that, although that's fairly rare. Usually if someone's saying they don't believe in it, they've studied it and they've got reasons for why they don't believe in it. But there are fundamental things to the Christian doctrine that such that if you deny those things and you actually understand what you're denying in denying them, you can't legitimately call yourself a Christian, and such that also if you deny them, you are not saved. You do not believe in the true gospel, and I think the Bible makes that clear. There are certain things, read John's epistles. There are certain things that if you deny them, you are making it very clear you're not a Christian and you're not under the blood of Christ. So, but it's it's more of a theological, scientific question on what are those things, what are the demarcations, and that might be a good topic for another time. But absolutely, you can. You've got to be really careful and studious and somewhat scientific about it. Cody, do you want to go ahead and share your closing thoughts?
Yeah, and also to add one thought to Greg is that there are ways to describe this that don't involve going quite so far as to say this person is not a Christian.
Yeah.
You can say that's outside of biblical orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. You can say that's not the teaching that I affirm to. There's other ways that you're just being very objective about, let me just describe the situation. The situation is that I affirm one thing and you affirm something else.
Yeah, and let me say it's important to emphasize that rather than to emphasize their status as a Christian or as saved, right? So especially when you're speaking publicly. The thing that matters in the public sphere is that this is outside of Christian orthodoxy. What does not matter as much in the public sphere, if at all, is that they are a Christian or that they are saved, right? That might matter more personally if you're talking to them privately and you're genuinely concerned and you want to warn them in love, then that's appropriate. But in the public sphere, it's very often very inappropriate to make that personal accusation rather than just saying this is outside of the realms of biblical orthodoxy, which is the more objective and more public thing that is of concern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because then it becomes almost an ad hominem, and to your audience, it's going to sound like you're just trying to attack the person
Exactly.
and being emotional. Whereas if it's a good friend and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in God," then you might, but I think I'm saved anyway, and I'm going to heaven. Then you might have to say, "Hey, I love you, and let's sit down and talk about this," and maybe have to address those things.
Yeah, exactly.
And I want to learn, like, well, you definitely send me the notes later of where that is in the letters of John. I would love to be able to read about that.
All right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure First John, that's the entire theme. Also Jude. So and they're both really short. So I would recommend just read all of First John and Jude, and I mean that's the theme of both of those books. So, Cody, go ahead. Sorry.
All right, well, let's wrap up the video with a couple of quotes that I think are relevant to us. I'm going to start with something from John Galt, and then I'm going to close out with a whole bunch of things from Paul. So from John Galt, the man who refuses to judge, who neither agrees nor disagrees, who declares that there are no absolutes and believes that he escapes responsibility, is the man responsible for all the blood that is now spilled in the world. Reality is an absolute. Existence is an absolute. A speck of dust is an absolute, and so is a human life. There are two sides to every issue. One side is right, the other is wrong, but the middle is always evil. The man who is wrong still retains some respect for truth, if only by accepting the responsibility of choice. But the man in the middle is the knave, who blanks out on the truth in order to pretend that no choice or values exist. And then a couple of thoughts from the Apostle Paul. So he writes in 1 Corinthians 4:16, I urge you then, be imitators of me. So what is he asking us to imitate? Here is a spectrum of some of the things that Paul has said. In Romans 12, he says, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. In Titus 3, he says, speak evil of no one. Avoid quarreling. Be gentle. Show perfect courtesy toward all people. But in 1 Timothy 5, he says, for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear. I think that's interesting because it means that he thinks that that's consistent with what he's already said. Mm-hmm. 2 Thessalonians 3, if anyone does not obey what we have said in this letter, take note of that person, have nothing to do with them, that they may be ashamed. Do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother. And summarizing the idea in 2 Corinthians 10, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. So that's my closing message from Paul about how we can be wise in our judgment and understand that judgment is morally necessary and understand how to do it. Jacob, I'll let you wrap up on this one.
I don't know that I can add much to that. Those were some very apt selections, both from Scripture and from John Galt's speech. I think the only thing I would add is that Rand talks about the man in the middle, the knave in the middle, is the rubber tube that transfuses the blood from the good into those who are evil. And so the refusal to make moral judgments, the failure to make moral judgments, not only encourages evil, but it harms the good. To do so is to discourage and actively oppose those who want to fight for what's true and good and beautiful and glorious, and to simultaneously encourage those who want to fight against what is good and true and glorious. And so that is the one place that we do not want to find ourselves, especially as Christians. And so it's important, and I would say even imperative, that we understand the value of making moral judgments and begin to really study studiously how to make moral judgments well. And that's a big topic. We've gotten into a little bit of it here. There's much more that you can get into. And so I definitely want to encourage everyone who listens to this to please set your mind to studying that and to asking the appropriate questions so that you can become disciplined in the art of discernment for the sake of the glory of God.
All right. Thank you guys for joining us on the call today. I'll see you next time.
Yep. Thanks, guys.